What's going on, everybody? James Hancock here. There's not a ton going on in the world of movies right now, so I thought it'd be an ideal time to dive into an ongoing topic, one that never ceases to bewilder me. On any given day on social media, you can find countless people freaking out one way or another about Martin Scorsese's lack of interest in Marvel. I think a lot of these tweets are just clickbait designed to get people all riled up, so I'm not going to call attention to any of the tweets that I found to be particularly stupid, because I have fallen for clickbait before and it made me feel not so smart. But what I will say is that if your whole life revolves around Marvel, just take the win. Over the last 10 years, you've been drowning in Marvel content, and over the next 10 years, there's even more coming your way. But I'm old enough to vividly recall what it was like to be a Marvel freak in the 80s, when it would have been more socially acceptable to my classmates to be a booger-eating moron than to be a fan of superheroes. At that time, I had one friend and one sibling who liked comics, and that was it. And we nurtured our obsession in private, quietly enjoying Frank Miller's run on Daredevil, Walt Simonson's run on Thor, John Byrne's run on Fantastic Four, Chris Claremont's run on X-Men, or Jim Shooter's mega crossover event, Secret Wars. It was a glorious time, but in the pre-internet age, it felt like we were the only ones who knew about it. My point to Marvel fans today is not to be so insecure about what Scorsese thinks. He's more than entitled to his opinion, and here's a little tough love to my fellow Marvel fanatics. There's more to cinema than Kevin Feige's plans for Phase 4. So what I want to talk about today are my top 10 favorite movies that I've discovered or rediscovered due to Martin Scorsese. Scorsese is obviously a legendary director with so many classics to his name, like Mean Streets, Taxi Driver, The Last Waltz, Raging Bull, King of Comedy, After Hours, The Color of Money, Goodfellas, Casino, and that's just in the 20th century. But in addition to being a brilliant filmmaker, he's also a passionate film historian, putting his money where his mouth is by making documentaries on the subject, writing books, and most important of all, restoring and re-releasing classic movies, all in an effort to preserve our cultural history. And when I see people claiming that Scorsese neither likes nor understands genre movies, I just shake my head. These people seem to think that there's only one genre. Let's put aside the many genre films that he's made personally, but as a movie lover, Scorsese's seen countless gangster movies, westerns, musicals, and science fiction epics. Decades before it was considered cool to talk about pop culture and movies, Scorsese gave Harvey Keitel this lengthy rant about The Searchers in Scorsese's debut feature film, Who's That Knocking at My Door?
Everybody should like westerns. Solve everybody's problems if they like westerns.
Okay, I like westerns.
Okay, then.
But the main reason I know that Scorsese is a freak for genre films is because back in the 90s, he made my all-time favorite documentary about movies that I've ever seen, A Personal Journey with Martin Scorsese Through American Movies, which I have right here on DVD alongside his book of the very same name. And the movie is basically this virtual museum where he walks us through decades of cinema, calling attention to many of his personal favorites. Of all the documentaries and movies out there, I've seen this one more than any other, and through this doc, many of Scorsese's favorite movies also became my favorite movies. So let's just get right into it, starting with my number 10. Back in the 90s, Scorsese was involved in this series of VHS cassettes celebrating some of his favorite classic movies, and each video would start with a little lecture by Scorsese, and in the days before YouTube, these lectures were an incredible resource for a young film freak like myself. The movies in this series were Raoul Walsh's Pursued, George Cukor's A Double Life, Nicholas Ray's Johnny Guitar, and the movie that I'm choosing for my number 10, Force of Evil, and it absolutely kills me that I lost my cassette long ago. But if Scorsese were a little older and had started making movies in the 1940s, you could easily imagine him directing this movie himself, and you can feel its influence on Raging Bull, Mean Streets, and Goodfellas. Directed by Abraham Polanski, the film stars John Garfield and Thomas Gomez as two brothers working in the numbers racket in New York. And the film brilliantly explores the age-old question, am I my brother's keeper? But more importantly, what happens when one brother rejects the other, knowing full well that he is corrupt and dangerous, no matter what his intentions might be? But the movie's filled with masterful dialogue and brilliant voiceover that would just absolutely leave you in awe.
The money has no moral opinions. I find I have, Joe. I find I have. And now I'm speaking to you. I'm speaking to you as your older brother who slaved for you. You stop now. Stop now, Joe. Because I'm getting old and old people die, and there'll be nobody to cry for you.
And there's also a small role for femme fatale icon Marie Windsor. And quick side note, director Robert Aldrich was an assistant director on this movie, and his name will be coming up again later on this list. And speaking of my list, let's soldier on to my number 9, All That Jazz. Ordinarily, I avoid musicals. I'm happy to watch the essential classics, but the genre is not necessarily my go-to. However, In his documentary, A Personal Journey, Scorsese includes this brilliant section where he makes the case for so many great musicals like 42nd Street, The Bandwagon, and best of all, Bob Fosse's All That Jazz, which I have right here on Criterion Blu-ray. I love movies about the dark side of showbiz, and I really love gritty flicks about New York in the 1970s, and this flick combines the best of both worlds, with Roy Scheider basically playing Bob Fosse himself, a chain-smoking, pill-popping, booze-swilling womanizer trying to put together the sexiest damn show on Broadway you could ever imagine. And quick heads up, keep a close eye out for a young Sandal Bergman in the erotica sequence. That scene alone makes this movie required viewing. But number 8, directed by John Ford. Now, the only thing I like more than watching old movies is watching great documentaries about old movies, and directed by John Ford is one of the good ones. Director Peter Bogdanovich recently passed away, and he left behind many classic movies like They All Laughed, Paper Moon, and The Last Picture Show. But for me, his obsession with film history, in particular the 1930s through the 1950s, had an even bigger impact on me than his movies. His books, Who the Devil Made It and This Is Orson Welles, were my Bibles back in college, and his documentary directed by John Ford deserves to be mentioned right in the same breath as those landmark books. If you love John Ford, and if you don't, shame on you, but if you love John Ford, this movie will give you waves of pleasure from start to finish.
Would you agree that the point of Fort Apache was that the tradition of the Army was more important than one individual?
Cut.
And only a few years ago, I got to see Scorsese and Bogdanovich side by side in a lengthy conversation during the premiere of The Other Side of the Wind at the New York Film Festival. Suffice to say, I was absolutely giddy. In any event, number 7, let's talk some film noir with a movie that might be the meanest, nastiest, most apocalyptic, and nightmarish film noir of them all, Robert Aldrich's adaptation of Mickey Spillane's Kiss Me Deadly. See, I told you Robert Aldrich would come up again, and I have his movie right here on Criterion Blu-ray, and on the surface, this is just a Mike Hammer story. Mike Hammer is scum, he's brutal, he's savage, always looking for a new angle to turn a buck. But what elevates this movie to one of the great crime films is its style. The opening alone is one of the most eerie and atmospheric sequences that I've ever seen. Hammer picks up this strange woman on a highway in the dead of night who admits to having recently escaped from an insane asylum. And then we watch the title sequence to the film in reverse, all to the music of Nat King Cole. It's the kind of sequence that David Lynch would excel at decades later, and then abruptly the scene transitions to what might be the most disturbing torture sequence of the 1950s, with all the violence discreetly taking place just out of frame. But toward the end of the movie, we almost get into mythological territory with the ultimate Pandora's box allegory about nuclear power. These scenes are absolutely horrifying and have directly inspired so many classic films like Raiders of the Lost Ark, Repo Man, and Pulp Fiction. It's just a brilliant, brutal, mean and nasty little crime film, and it'll always have an honored place in my collection, as will my number 6, another deliciously stylish and ruthless crime film, this time from director John Borman, starring Lee Marvin and Angie Dickinson. Point Blank. The editing in this film is nothing short of revolutionary, cutting back and forth from scenes taking place in the heads of the characters to whatever acts of violence might be unfolding in the present. This is Lee Marvin in pure Angel of Death mode, while Angie Dickinson, well, the scene where she repeatedly slaps the shit out of Lee Marvin immediately makes the movie an astonishing viewing experience. But she will also leave every red-blooded man or woman drooling with desire. As she once famously said, "I dress for women, I undress for men." And speaking of getting buck-ass naked, let's use that as a segue into my number 5, Jean-Luc Godard's Contempt, starring sexual icon Brigitte Bardot. I first saw Contempt at the New Art in Los Angeles back in the late 90s, and all I knew ahead of time was that Scorsese's name was attached to the re-release of the movie, along with a blurb by him describing it as one of the best movies about movies that he'd ever seen. Well, I concur. I was floored by the experience. You've got Fritz Lang playing himself, directing an adaptation of The Odyssey, all while his screenwriter has this epic falling out with his beautiful wife for essentially offering her up to their producer, played by Jack Palance. And contempt is almost too nice a word for the emotions that she feels for him, but this flick is a film historian's delight with countless references to directors like Howard Hawks, but all film history nuggets aside, the music and photography would just make you feel pure euphoria. But I've got my old Criterion DVD from back in the day right here, and it is beaten to death from being watched over and over the years, and I'm going to cut away to a shot of my wall where you will see a poster of Contempt prominently displayed. I wish I could say it's an original, but it's only a reprint. But if you're a fan of classic movie poster design, it is tough to think of a poster that is superior to the one for Contempt. But let's get back into some genre filmmaking. I've barely mentioned the Western genre in this video, and Scorsese is a fucking freak for Westerns, so for my number 4, I'm going with Bud Bedeker's The Tall T, starring Randolph Scott.
You do it for Randolph Scott.
Randolph Scott.
In A Personal Journey with Martin Scorsese, he speaks at length about this movie, in particular the relationship between the characters played by Randolph Scott and his adversary played by Richard Boone. And Boone and his men are just evil incarnate. They kill a boy early on and just casually dispose of the body in a well, but Boone's character, he can't help but feel a rapport with Randolph Scott, sharing similar goals and values, even if his methods will inevitably lead to gunplay between the two of them.
You cook good coffee, Brennan.
Talk.
What about?
Your place. What's it like?
It's not much, not yet anyway.
But Bud Bedeker and Randolph Scott, they made many movies together, but this one is my personal fave and gets my highest possible recommendation. Number 3, Sweet Smell of Success. I've spoken on this channel before about this movie and the short film, The Movies That Define New York Part 1, directed by Bill Tech, co-starring the great Bill Scurry, but I love this movie so much, I'm going to discuss it again. If you like mean and nasty films about New York, if you like jazz, if you like unrepentant diabolical villains who get real pleasure out of embracing their dark side, and best of all, if you like great writing, Sweet Smell of Success is just a masterclass in filmmaking. It was scripted by writing legends Clifford Odets and Ernest Lehman, and the dialogue in this movie is so good that it makes most other movies by comparison feel like they were written by children just smashing their fists on a typewriter. But great dialogue won't get you anywhere unless you have the actors who can pull it off, and holy shit, Burt Lancaster and Tony Curtis are nothing short of brilliant in this movie, despising one another and using one another in equal measure to achieve their goals.
But we happen to know I'm your star pupil because I reflect back to you your own talent. I'd hate to take a bite of you. You're a cookie full of arsenic.
And speaking of this movie, when it comes to my movie poster collection, I only have one poster that's the genuine article from the time in which the movie was released, and that is for The Sweet Smell of Success, and it'll always be one of my most prized possessions. But we're getting near the end of my list, one that would be incomplete without mentioning the work of one of the greatest filmmakers who ever lived. So for my number 2, I'm going with Barry Lyndon from director Stanley Kubrick. Of all the directors covered in his epic documentary, Scorsese arguably gives the most love and attention to Kubrick's career. Now, back in college, my friends and I were Kubrick fanatics, and we watched most of his movies on repeat. I even saw Barry Lyndon in the theater at the New Beverly in Los Angeles. But back in the late 90s, Barry Lyndon was kind of like the dark horse or black sheep of Kubrick's movies. People didn't really talk about it all that much, or at least we didn't. But nowadays, film fanatics sing his praises left and right. But for whatever reason, I just couldn't appreciate it 25 years ago when I was first going all in as a cinephile. I was 20, and like every 20-year-old out there, I thought I knew everything there was to know about the movies. Often wrong, but never in doubt, as the old expression goes. But when I saw Scorsese's doc and listened to his insights on this movie, I was encouraged to go back and watch it again. Then I started watching it repeatedly with relish and delight. So in spite of my own mental handicaps or just being an ignorant fool, I was finally able to see the light on this epic film, the kind they truly don't make anymore. Easily one of Kubrick's most ambitious, grand, and majestic movies. I will forever be in Scorsese's debt for opening my eyes to this colossal film. And at last we come to my number 1 with what might be the most Baroque film ever made, The Scarlet Empress from director Joseph von Sternberg. Joseph von Sternberg and Marlene Dietrich made 7 movies together, many of which I love dearly, but it's with this movie that their collaboration reached its creative zenith, with a story about the ascent of Catherine the Great and the regiment of lovers that she used and then disposed of as she assumed total control over the Russian Empire. If you're looking for things like gritty authenticity or historical historical accuracy, well, this movie's not for you. But if you want to see an exquisite exercise in pure style, the type of style that's only possible when a tyrannical megalomaniac like Sternberg has the full resources of a prestigious studio like Paramount at his disposal, well, then you need to see The Scarlet Empress, a thunderous flop in its day, but easily one of the best films of that tumultuous period as Hollywood first began to enforce the restrictive production code, a code which would make uninhibited films like this one basically impossible to make for the next few decades. But sadly, we've come to the end of this journey for now. Inevitably, I'll be returning to the subject of Scorsese in the near future to count down my top 10 favorite movies that he personally directed, but for the time being, I think I've gotten what I wanted to say off my chest, expressing my sincere gratitude for what his contributions to film history have meant to me. Hopefully everyone enjoyed my little spiel. If so, remember to like, subscribe, hit the bell, and leave a comment below, but more importantly, as always, onwards and upwards.